So we start our journey in microeconomics by talking about the second half of that word, right? Economics. What is this thing we call economics? Well, economics, which is a word created by Aristotle, actually, talking about the different organization of economic activity. He split it up into O economica and cremestike. O economica relating to the management of resources within the household or within the nation, and cremestike talking about the trade between nations, right? Which, wasn't a hell of a lot back in Aristotle's day. So for whatever reason, we picked up on O economica, and that's where we come with economics. So it comes from Aristotle, and economics is the study of how humans make decisions in the face of scarcity. So it's a problem of unlimited wants and needs and limited resources. So if we ever get to a point like where, Star Trek and we have replicators and stuff, right? Economics really won't exist as a discipline anymore, right? Because we won't have limited resources. And there's actually a very interesting arm of economics called PAR economics, which is called participatory economics, which is postulating about the science fiction of a day such as that in the future, when we are at a situation where we are post-scarcity. Maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. Part of the issue is this unlimitedness, right? Even if our needs get met, our wants keep evolving. So even though our resources are, so much above and beyond those of 200 years ago, our wants and needs have also increased concomitantly. So economics is talking about individual decisions by businesses, by families, by governments, and really by society writ large. And scarcity is talking about that fact that these limited resources are things that we want. They are desirable. So we don't talk about, there's no such thing as a scarcity of pollution, right? We only talk about scarcity for what are called economic goods. So scarcity, not just as it relates to resources, but as it relates to desirable resources. So economics started in 1776 when a guy named Adam Smith wrote his famous book named The Wealth of Nations. And up until this point, people thought that nations' wealth was comprised of their gold stock, right? It was comprised of how much gold they had in their treasury. Part of this was because, let's say that you were doing trade with another country. You didn't want that other country's paper money, right? It was pretty much worthless. You wanted them to settle that trade in gold. The other part of why gold was your stock of wealth was because, let's say that you were, let's say you're France and you're paying the French Foreign Legion. They don't want it. They're not taking francs, right? Back in 1600s, 1700s, any kind of mercenary fighters would be paid only in gold. And so the way that you paid your militias and your military was in gold. And so your gold stockpile was very much representative of the strength or wealth of your nation. So Adam Smith came along and turned this whole notion on its head and said, well, actually, it's not the amount of gold that they're holding, it's their economic activity. It's how much production happens in that economy in a year. And so really flipped economics from this notion of, well, not economics because it didn't quite exist yet, flipped the notion of value of countries from a stock situation, right? So if we think about like a bathtub and the stock of water being the level of water in the bathtub, like the stock pile of gold, right? That's how we used to measure the wealth. And now we're talking about economic activity, which is the flow of water into the bathtub, right? So we switched from looking at a stock variable to looking at a flow variable. And that's what started economics writ large. One of the more famous things that Adam Smith talked about in The Wealth of Nations, as well as redefining what national wealth meant, he also highlighted the division of labor. The division of labor that he was seeing in industry during the Industrial Revolution. And this is the way in which different workers divide required tasks to produce a good or a service. And so specifically, he went and looked at pin factories, right? And he went and looked at these artisanal pin producers, these people that made pins all by themselves, right? And then he went and looked at a pin factory. And one would think that, okay, if you have 10 people working at the pin factory, they're going to make 10 times the amount of pins that one person working at a pin factory can make, right? It's not that simple. What we found is that by dividing and assigning those individual discrete tasks to different workers, the amount of extra pins that you can make in a day was something like 3,000% more. So the fact that you had one person just focusing on straightening the wire, you had one person just focusing on cutting the correct length of it, you had one person just focusing on making the nail heads, you had one person on focusing on putting the nail heads onto the pin, right? So if you split this up into a bunch of discrete little tasks and you set them up on an assembly line, right? I mean, we all know this from, you know, the whole Henry Ford, assembly line, right? Fordism, Taylorism situation. We learned about that in middle school and high school. But it really goes further back than that. It goes further back than the 1910s and assembly lines and the modern automobile, right? It goes all the way back to the 1700s and Adam Smith talking about this very simple thing, the pin factory. And specifically, they were talking about specialization. So that's when workers or firms focus on particular tasks for which they are well suited within the overall production process. So specialization is the foundation upon which economies of scale emerge, right? Which is the notion that you can increase your inputs and then your outputs increase by a factor greater than the inputs. So essentially the average cost of producing whatever you're producing declines as the size of your enterprise increases. So economics, it's a relatively modern discipline, compared to a lot of other sciences and social sciences, and has gone through a few stages of revolution in terms of new paradigms being added, right? The first one happened during the Great Depression. John Maynard Keynes came along. We'll talk about him in a second. And then the second one happened about 15 years ago during the great financial crisis of 2008. Essentially, what happened was the economics profession got really full of itself, right? Got big for their britches. And the hubris that economists had at the time was that the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, said that we are now entering a new period of great moderation, in which the technical instruments and the ability of central banks and treasuries and monetary policy is able to essentially temper all of the vicissitudes of the real business cycle. And then the great financial crisis happened and just completely caught all the economists by surprise. And it reinvigorated, there was a lot of re-innovating of economics as a result of that. And so we went into the great financial crisis of 2008 with pretty much everybody being this one type of economist, these neoclassical economists. And we came out with a much more what's called heterodox. There's many more schools of thought in economics these days as a result of the failure of the neoclassical economic system to not only predict, but even catch a whiff of the great financial crisis that happened in 2008, which nearly caused another global recession. Depression, sorry. Did cause a global recession, nearly caused a global depression. So why do we care about this? Well, it impacts us, right? It impacts our likelihood of getting a job when we graduate or not. I graduated my undergrad in the middle of that great financial crisis, so there were like no jobs, especially for somebody who, I had IT experience and stuff like that, but I didn't have a ton of internship or business experience. There was no jobs. So, economics is going to dictate if there's going to be jobs or not when you graduate, right? And that might dictate whether you go to grad school, whether you go get extra training, so on and so forth. But it also just has an impact on who we vote for, so on and so forth. It has an impact on our budget, right? We're seeing, record inflation the last year and a half that we haven't seen in 50 years here in the United States. We have been very, very used to low levels of inflation. That hasn't been the norm for a lot of other places. And even though we've had inflation, still a lot better than some places around the world. UK, Turkey, other places like that have been really hit hard by inflation, right? So economics is important for us to know, not just for our personal lives, but also just to be a citizen of the world and to be an educated voter.